Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. When I was about 14 or 15, my family used to go camping at this state park almost every summer. It wasn't anything fancy, just one of those quiet, wooded parks with a few dozen campsites spread out around a small lake. Most of the people who stayed there were families like ours, people who came to fish, hike, and sit around a campfire until late at night. By the second or third trip, my best friend started coming along. His parents trusted mine, and we both loved those trips because it meant freedom, no school. No noise, no rules beyond be back by midnight. Every night, after everyone had settled down and the campfires around the loop were starting to die out, he and I would walk into the woods. We called it the ritual. It wasn't anything serious, just something we did to make the trip feel different from home. We'd grab our flashlights, wander down one of the trails, and talk about random things. School, movies, stuff we didn't want our parents hearing. The woods at night had a strange comfort to them. The air always felt cooler and heavier. The sound of insects and the crunch of our shoes on dry leaves made everything feel alive, even when we couldn't see much beyond a few feet. We usually didn't go far, maybe a few hundred yards from our campsite before looping back. But one night we decided to go further. It was our last night there that summer, and we wanted to do something different. I remember the moon was bright enough that we barely needed our flashlights. The beams from other campsites were long gone, and the path ahead was just a faint opening between the trees. We joked about how far we could get before getting lost, but there was something exciting about being out there in the dark with no one else around. We walked for what felt like 20 minutes. The air smelled like pine and damp soil. Every so often a branch snapped somewhere behind us, probably a raccoon or something, but we didn't think much of it. We liked to test ourselves by turning off our flashlights, trying to see how long we could walk before one of us chickened out and turned it back on. It made every sound sharper, every movement in the dark feel close. At one point, we stopped to listen. The forest had gone quiet. The bugs and frogs were still making noise, but something about the air felt different, like the woods were waiting for something. That's when we heard it. A soft whispering sound just behind us. It was so faint that at first I thought it was the wind, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like actual words. They were too quiet to understand, like someone talking to themselves just a few steps behind. My friend turned on his flashlight fast, and the beam cut through the darkness, hitting the trees and ground around us. Nothing, just empty forest. The whispering stopped immediately. We stood there, both breathing hard, listening. Everything was silent again. I tried to tell myself it was just the woods playing tricks on us. Maybe the sound of leaves moving or water dripping, but I could feel my heart racing. We decided to keep walking, just a bit further before heading back. A few minutes later, we heard it again, closer this time. Still whispering, but faster, like whoever or whatever it was had picked up the pace. I felt my stomach twist. My friend swung his flashlight around again, and the light moved over the trees, the ground, the brush. That's when we saw her. She was on the ground, maybe 20 feet away, crawling toward us. Her clothes were dark and covered in dirt, and her hair hung over her face in messy strands. She wasn't moving like someone hurt, though, just steady, crawling like she didn't care how filthy she got. Her voice was the whisper we'd heard. Just a jumble of words spilling out under her breath. I couldn't tell what she was saying, but it didn't sound like anything that made sense. For a second, we both froze. The only sound was the crunch of leaves as she moved closer. When the light hit her face, she blinked like the brightness hurt her eyes. And then, as if realizing we were actually there, she stopped crawling and slowly stood up. Up close, she looked maybe in her 30s. Her face was streaked with dirt, and her shirt was torn near one shoulder. She swayed a little as she stood, and for a second I thought she might fall. My friend kept his flashlight on her. and I could see how pale she was, like she hadn't slept in days. She didn't seem dangerous, just lost, confused. We stood there for a few seconds that felt like forever, before she mumbled something about looking for her campsite. She didn't seem to know which direction she'd come from, and the way she talked didn't make much sense. It hit me then that she was probably drunk, maybe high. Still, seeing her crawl out of the darkness like that, whispering, had scared the hell out of us. We told her to follow us and started heading back toward camp. She stumbled a few times, tripping over roots, laughing once for no reason, then going quiet again. Every few minutes she'd mumble something random under her breath. Stuff like, "I thought I saw it here," or "They said it was by the light." We didn't respond, just kept walking, trying not to look at each other. The walk back felt longer than it should have. The woods looked different now, each shadow deeper, every sound heavier. I kept glancing behind us to make sure she was still there. She was, walking with her head down, sometimes running her hands along the trees as if to keep her balance. When we finally saw the faint orange glow of the campground fires through the trees, I felt the biggest wave of relief I've ever felt in my life. We led her toward the nearest campsite, and as soon as we got closer, a group of people started calling out. One of them ran up, clearly drunk too, laughing when he saw her. Turned out she had wandered off hours earlier trying to find the bathroom, and just never came back. None of them had even realized she was gone. They thanked us half-heartedly, though I don't think they really understood how close she'd come to spending the whole night lost out there. It was a big park, miles of woods between the campsites and the outer roads. She could have wandered deeper in, maybe gotten hurt or passed out. We didn't say much to them. We just nodded, turned, and went back to our own site. When we got back, everyone else was asleep. We sat by the dying campfire for a while, not saying anything. The woods behind us looked the same as they always did, dark and endless. But that night they didn't feel the same. The idea that someone could just be out there, alone, whispering in the dirt, so close to being lost forever, stuck with me. After that, we never went that far again. The ritual still happened on later trips, but we stayed close to the light, close enough to see the glow of the campfires through the trees. Every time the forest went quiet, I'd think back to that woman crawling through the leaves, whispering nonsense into the dark, and realize how easily things can go wrong out there. It wasn't a ghost story or some wild mystery, just a real reminder that sometimes the scariest thing in the woods is another person who's lost their way. I've camped a lot in my life. I've seen storms, strange things left behind, people doing stupid stuff in the woods, but a few trips have stuck with me more than anything else. They weren't the kind of scary that comes from ghosts or monsters. They were the kind that makes you realize how small and vulnerable you really are when you're out there, far away from everything familiar. The first time that feeling really hit me was when I was camping with my wife in a jack pine forest. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just the two of us, a small tent and a fire. The weather had been calm all day, warm, with only a light breeze that stirred the tops of the trees. But right around dusk, the wind changed. It wasn't a gradual thing. One moment the air was still. The next it came alive, like the whole forest was suddenly breathing too fast. The sound of the wind through the jack pines turned into a roar that swallowed everything else. I've heard windstorms before, but this one felt wrong from the start. The trees around us were tall and thin, their trunks swaying in unison, creaking like old wooden beams. Every few seconds there'd be a sharp crack from somewhere deeper in the woods, branches snapping, or maybe full trees going down. The tent walls pushed in hard, then snapped back out like someone was hitting it. I remember the sound of pine cones and small sticks pelting the rainfly. My wife was inside the tent holding onto the poles like it would make a difference, and I was outside trying to tie down the guy lines tighter. The air was filled with the smell of sap and dirt. I could hear trees falling, not close enough to crush us, but close enough that I felt every thud in my chest. I kept scanning the tree line with my flashlight. half expecting to see one coming down toward us. The ground even seemed to move under my feet a few times, like the roots beneath were tearing loose. I thought about taking the car and getting out, but the trail back was narrow, and trees were dropping across it. If one went down while we were on it, we'd be trapped anyway, so we just rode it out. I sat in the tent doorway, watching flashes of light from branches sparking as they scraped each other, listening to the forest tearing itself apart. It went on for hours before the wind finally started to die off, leaving that deep, eerie silence that only comes after chaos. In the morning, everything was coated in a thin layer of needles and broken bark. A few big pines had gone down within 100 feet of us. One of them had crushed a boulder-sized chunk of granite into powder. I don't think I've ever felt so lucky just to be alive. That trip stuck with me for a long time. But the creepiest one happened later, when I went camping with my best friend in a semi-remote spot. It was the kind of place you could only reach with a proper 4x4 truck, down a road that looked more like an old logging trail than anything maintained. It wasn't deep wilderness, but it was far enough that you couldn't just call for help if something went wrong. The campground itself was barely hanging on, rotting picnic tables, fire pits full of half-burnt trash, an old wooden sign with faded lettering. There were 2 outhouses off to the side, their doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. We set up camp in the late afternoon, got the tent pitched, and started gathering some wood. My buddy wandered over to the outhouses to check which one was usable. I saw him open the first door, stand there for a second, then close it slowly and walk to the second one. He went inside that one and stayed for a few minutes, then came back without saying much. He looked kind of weirded out and told me to go look inside the first one. I figured maybe an animal had gotten trapped in there or someone had made a mess. But when I opened the door, I froze. Inside, stacked against the far wall, were 3 full-sized hiking backpacks. They were big, week-long trip kind of big, all zipped up neatly. No signs of damage or dirt, just sitting there like someone had left them and planned to come back. We couldn't help ourselves. We unzipped them. The first 2 were normal. Camping gear, clothes, sleeping bags, a small stove, some food. All decent stuff, good brands, nothing weird. But the third one stopped us cold. It was full of Skittles, nothing else. Just bags and bags of Skittles. Bulk bags, family size, mini packs, tropical flavors, sour ones, regular ones, even the big industrial-size bags like you'd see at a candy store. Every inch of that pack was filled with them. It must have been over 80 liters of candy. We both stood there for a long time just trying to figure it out. It wasn't funny. It wasn't some prank. Who hauls 3 big packs out to a remote campsite, leaves 2 full of good gear, and 1 full of Skittles? And why leave them all hidden inside an outhouse? We stayed 4 days. Never saw anyone else. No other cars. No voices. Nothing. Every morning we'd check just to see if maybe someone came back for them. They never did. When we finally left, we let the conservation officers know when we got back to civilization. They looked at us like they didn't quite believe it, but they said they'd check it out. I've thought about that trip a lot since then. I don't know what the story behind those packs was, but something about it still feels wrong. Like we saw the edge of something we weren't supposed to. The last one that really shook me was when I went backpacking with my dog. It wasn't far from the road, just a quick overnight trip to clear my head. I had a tarp set up as a small shelter, a little fire going, nothing fancy. It was quiet, peaceful. I wasn't exactly hiding, but I wasn't in plain sight either. Just me and the dog lying there half asleep, when the sound of an engine tore through the silence. It was a truck coming fast, maybe 100 yards away. Then came voices. Drunk voices, loud and slurred, echoing through the trees. Laughter, shouts, the kind that carry the edge of carelessness. Then came the gunshots, sharp cracks that bounced through the woods. I froze. The dog tensed up, ears flat. I realized then how close I was to another dirt road, probably one that branched off the main trail. The direction of the gunfire sounded like it was toward me, or at least close enough to make me think so. I could hear them cheering, firing again and again. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I grabbed my pack, doused the fire with dirt, and clipped the leash on my dog. We moved fast and quiet through the trees. No flashlight, just moonlight, and the faint glow from their truck headlights cutting through the branches. I didn't stop until I could no longer hear them. I slept that night tucked against a rocky slope, too afraid to light another fire. The next morning, I walked back to my car along a different route. When I finally reached it, the relief I felt just sitting in that seat was overwhelming. It's one thing to deal with the power of nature, but people, especially drunk people with guns, are something else entirely. All those trips taught me different kinds of fear. The storm reminded me how powerless we are against the earth. The Skittles packs showed me that people can be far stranger than you'd ever guess. And that night with the gunfire reminded me that the scariest thing in the wild usually isn't the wilderness at all. It's whoever else might be out there with you. We went on a group camping trip deep in the middle of nowhere in northern Arizona, the kind of spot where the dirt roads narrow until you can barely tell if you're still on one. It was one of those trips that felt like a good idea during daylight. Cheap beers in a cooler, firewood strapped down, everyone joking that we needed a weekend away from work. We ended up in a clearing surrounded by tall junipers and pines. Not another campsite or even a single house for miles. The nearest sign of civilization was a faded Forest Service sign about 12 miles back. Half covered in dust and bullet holes. It was late spring, warm enough that you didn't need a jacket during the day, but cold enough at night that you wanted to crawl deep into your sleeping bag. We had 3 tents, mine with 2 friends, another with 3 guys, and one more with a couple that came along. We'd built a decent fire pit and cooked cheap burgers over the flames while the sun went down. Everything felt normal. Someone joked about mountain lions, another about bears. But it was all the kind of dumb talk you do to fill silence before everyone crashes. We stored our food in coolers near the trucks, not bothering to hang them or lock anything up. By the time the fire was just embers, everyone had gone to bed. The night was dead quiet, not even a breeze through the trees. I remember thinking how total the silence felt. No cars, no frogs, no wind, just nothing. I fell asleep fast. Sometime after midnight, I woke up because I heard something outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunching in the dirt and pine needles. At first, I figured one of my friends got up to pee. But then came this slow, deliberate sound, like something sniffing. A long inhale right along the tent wall, then again moving slowly around to the back of the tent. I froze. My first thought was a bear or maybe a coyote, and I instantly regretted not locking the coolers. My heart started pounding so loud I swore it would give me away. I didn't move or say anything, just stared into the darkness above me. Then I realized the sniffing was too close, too precise. It wasn't snuffling through a cooler. It was moving along the fabric of the tent itself. A shape shifted faintly against the thin nylon, and I could tell it was upright. That's when I knew it wasn't an animal. The sniffing stopped, then I heard footsteps moving toward the tent next to ours. That sound of feet on dry dirt, soft, dragging a little. I turned my head and saw the outline of my buddy beside me, eyes open wide. We didn't need to say anything. Everyone in my tent was awake and listening, breathing shallowly. The air inside the tent felt tight, like the space had shrunk. The footsteps circled the next tent. I could hear the person's breath, faint but steady, and then a zipper jingle on one of our coolers. Metal clinking, lids opening, things shifting around. Whoever it was, they were rummaging through our stuff like they owned it. Suddenly, one of my friends in the next tent unzipped his and burst out yelling, loud, harsh, the kind of yell meant to scare a bear. I heard him stomp and kick at something, his voice echoing off the trees. There was chaos for a few seconds. Shouts, movement, someone tripping. I sat up, unzipped our tent, and aimed my flashlight toward the sound. In the weak beam, I saw a figure, definitely a man, bolting toward the dark tree line. He didn't look back. He was barefoot or in socks, clothes ragged, and ran like he'd done this before. We all got out, flashlights sweeping the woods, but he was gone. The coolers were open, food scattered, and there were prints all around our tents, bare footprints. No shoes, the guy had been sniffing at us. We packed up right then, no one even arguing. It was nearly 3 a.m., and by 3:30 we were driving down the rough dirt road, the fire still glowing behind us. None of us talked much. A year later, against all sense, we went back near that same area. I don't even know why. I guess we figured it was just some drifter who happened to find us, a one-time thing. This time we came more prepared, or so we thought. We had better lights, more people, and instead of tents, we decided to sleep in the beds of our trucks and SUVs. The logic was that it'd be safer, easier to drive off if anything weird happened. We parked in a circle, built a fire in the middle, and joked about how we'd outsmarted any creeps this time. Around midnight, the fire had burned low, everyone either asleep or half dozing. I was in the back of my SUV with my girlfriend, bundled in a blanket. The tailgate cracked open for air. The night was still, the sky clear enough that you could see the Milky Way stretching like dust across the black. It felt peaceful. I must have drifted off around then. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but I remember the feeling first. Heat on my face. Not sunlight. A bright white light shining directly through the back window of the SUV. It was so strong that it lit the inside like a flashlight pressed against glass. I didn't move. I knew instantly it wasn't one of my friends. No one else would be walking around with a flashlight in the middle of the night, pointing it into our cars. I kept my eyes barely open, trying to stay perfectly still. The light stayed on my face for what felt like forever. I could hear faint movement outside, footsteps in the gravel, slow and deliberate. The light finally drifted away, moving toward the next truck. I turned my head just enough to see through the window. An older man, gray beard, jacket hanging loose, was walking between the vehicles, shining his flashlight into each one. He leaned close to the windows, staring at everyone inside. I didn't move. My girlfriend stayed completely still beside me. I could feel her breathing shallow and fast. I watched as the man stopped at another truck, stood there for several seconds, just looking in. One of my friends was snoring softly inside, and the sound of that snore was somehow the most unnerving thing in the world. So normal, so unaware. The man eventually turned away and disappeared into the trees. I waited until I couldn't hear his steps anymore. Then I slipped out quietly, heart hammering, and ran to the nearest truck. Everyone I woke was already half awake, eyes wide, all of them pretending to be asleep like I had. We didn't even bother looking for him this time. We just packed what we could and drove out of there in a line. Engines roaring through the dark, headlights bouncing off the trees. When we reached the highway, we finally stopped. No one said anything for a while. We were all staring out at the empty desert stretching for miles, realizing how deep in the middle of nowhere we'd been. No cell service, no houses, just that one man, walking around our campsite, shining his light on each of us as we slept. We never went back to that part of Arizona again. I was camping alone in a small valley somewhere in the foothills of Central Oregon. I'd driven out there for a weekend just to clear my head, away from the noise and the endless messages and calls that usually found me. So I picked a place where I knew there wouldn't be any cell service. I remember that day started off calm and quiet, the kind of silence that almost makes your ears ring. The air was cool, a faint smell of pine mixed with the river that ran somewhere behind the trees. I spent most of the afternoon hiking a trail that climbed up the side of the valley. And I didn't really pay attention to how far I'd gone until the light started fading. By the time I started heading back, the sky was turning that dark blue that means the sun is gone, but it's not quite night yet. My legs were sore and my shirt was sticking to me. I was alone out there, but not scared. At least not until I realized how quickly the shadows were swallowing the trail. I was still maybe half a mile from the road when I ran into a guy coming the other way. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, rough around the edges but friendly. He had that local look, sunburned face, worn clothes, a calm way of standing that said he knew this place better than anyone passing through. He asked if I was camping out. And I said, yeah, just trying to find a good spot before it got too dark. He nodded, told me there was a place not far from the road right near the river. Said it was hidden, sort of camouflaged by brush, but locals used it sometimes. It sounded perfect, quiet, close to water, and easy to get to. He led me back toward the road and pointed it out. Sure enough, there was a little turnout I never would have noticed if I'd been driving past. From the outside, it looked like nothing, just bushes and overgrown grass. But a small path led to a clearing maybe 50 yards in, right next to the riverbank. I thanked him, told him I owed him one, and he just smiled and waved before heading back up the trail. I remember feeling relieved to have run into him. I set up my fire ring, got a small blaze going, cracked open a beer, and started listening to one of my friend's comedy podcasts. It was already fully dark by then, and the firelight made the trees look alive around the edges, moving and swaying. I didn't care though. The beer was cold, the night air felt good, and for once I didn't have to think about anything or anyone else. Because it was already dark, I decided I wasn't going to mess with setting up my tent. I had my truck with me, an old Tacoma with a topper on the back. I spread my sleeping bag out in the truck bed beside all my gear, and crawled in there once the fire burned down low. The sound of the river was constant and heavy, like distant static. I fell asleep faster than I thought I would. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was spilling through the cracks of the topper, and everything outside was quiet except for birds in the river. I climbed out, stretched, and felt that stiffness in my back that comes from sleeping on something that's definitely not a bed. Got the fire going again and cracked open another beer, while I started frying up some eggs and bacon on my small camp stove. The smell filled the clearing, and for a moment I felt perfectly at peace. That's when I noticed someone at the edge of my camp. He was just standing there, maybe 20 feet away, half hidden by the trees. At first I thought it was the same local guy from last night. But then I looked closer. This man was older, thinner, with a long gray beard that looked tangled and dirty. His clothes were covered in what looked like dozens of plastic grocery bags tied all over. On his arms, his legs, even hanging from his belt. Some fluttered slightly in the morning breeze, crinkling faintly. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look at me. I tried to be friendly. I said something like, "Nice morning," just to break the silence. Nothing. He didn't respond or even turn his head. He just sort of paced around the edge of my camp in a slow, uneven way, like he wasn't really sure where he was going. His eyes were somewhere else, staring at the ground or maybe past me entirely. I figured maybe he was homeless, living rough out there. I didn't want to make it weird, so I offered him breakfast, told him I had plenty. No reaction, not even a glance. He just kept walking in this lazy half-circle, always staying at the edge of the clearing. I felt this tension start building in my chest. There was something wrong about how still his face was, how disconnected he looked from everything around him. I tried again, asked if he wanted a beer, figuring maybe that'd get a response. He stopped walking, turned his back to me, and just stood there. His shoulders were hunched, and those plastic bags rustled against each other with every small movement. The sound of it got under my skin. It hit me then that I was completely alone out here. No cell service, no one else around, no witnesses. I suddenly couldn't stop thinking about the fact that I'd been loud last night, laughing, listening to the podcast, drinking by the fire. Anyone could have seen the glow from the flames through the trees. I started wondering if this guy had been watching me, maybe even while I was sleeping in my truck. I reached slowly for my bear spray, which was sitting beside me on a rock next to my stove. I kept my eyes on him the whole time. My buck knife was lying in the open bed of my truck just a few steps away. The air felt heavy, like the whole world was holding its breath. He finally moved again, just a few steps forward, but he still wouldn't look at me. I could feel my heartbeat in my neck. My mouth went dry. I didn't know if he was high, mentally unstable, or just trying to mess with me. But I wasn't about to sit there and wait for whatever came next. I stood up and yelled at him, told him he needed to either acknowledge me or leave right now. My voice echoed through the trees, but he didn't move. He didn't flinch. Nothing, just the sound of the river and the faint crackle of my fire. That was the breaking point. I grabbed the bear spray, took a few steps toward him and raised it. The moment I did, he sort of wilted, shoulders slumped, head down. Then he turned slowly and started walking away, dragging his feet, the bags whispering against each other until he disappeared behind the brush. I stood there for a good minute, listening, waiting to hear if he'd stopped or turned around. Nothing. Just silence again. I didn't even bother finishing breakfast. I kicked dirt over the fire, grabbed my cooler, my stove, everything, and tossed it all into the back of the truck. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped one of the pans. I slammed the tailgate shut, climbed in, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway with my phone finally showing bars again. I pulled over, sat there, and tried to process what had just happened. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe he had seen me the night before, maybe even watched me crawl into the back of my truck and fall asleep. If I'd set up my tent out in the open instead, I don't think I would have slept through the night. The more I thought about it, the more it sank in that the only thing standing between me and whatever that man might have done was a layer of metal and glass. I drove home that day and haven't camped alone since. Sometimes when I think back on it, I can still see him in my mind, standing there at the edge of the trees, plastic bags rustling softly in the wind, not saying a word, not even looking at me, just waiting. My family went camping every summer when I was growing up. It was kind of our tradition. The one thing we always did, no matter how busy everyone got. We'd take the old green minivan, pile it full of gear, and drive out to the coast. Usually we'd bounce between Virginia Beach, Assateague, and this awful mosquito-infested place called Westmoreland. My dad liked Westmoreland for the fishing. My mom liked Assateague for the beach. And I just liked being anywhere that didn't smell like bug spray or burnt hot dogs. That particular year, I think I was around 10 or 11. My sister had just started high school, and she acted like she was too old for camping now. But she still came along. My parents had picked Assateague that summer, which was exciting for me because I liked the wild ponies. Everyone who camps there knows about them. They wander freely, graze near the dunes, and sometimes even stroll through campsites like they own the place. They look calm, but the rangers warn you not to get close. They're not pets. They're feral. I'd heard stories of them kicking over coolers and biting people who tried to feed them. We got there late in the afternoon after a long drive. The campground was right near the beach, just a few dunes away from the ocean. You could hear the waves all day, and the salty air hung heavy around the tents. My dad set up the big family tent, and my mom helped me pitch the smaller one a little ways off, maybe 20 feet from the main one. She said she wanted me to start learning how to camp on my own, though really it was just me sleeping near them, but not with them. The sand was soft, still warm from the sun, and full of small hoofprints even near our campsite. You could tell the ponies passed through often. By the time the fire was burning and dinner was done, the wind had picked up. It was that kind of steady ocean wind that never stops, carrying the sound of the waves and the occasional distant whinny of a pony. The campground had quieted down after sunset, just a few flickering fires and murmured voices around us. My dad was snoring before long, and my sister had her headphones on in her sleeping bag, pretending she wasn't with us. I remember lying there, listening to the canvas of the tent flap gently, the sand shifting outside, and the rhythmic crash of the ocean. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of movement. Not loud, just the soft scrape of something brushing against the side of the tent. I figured it was the wind at first. But then it came again, slower this time, like something dragging lightly along the fabric. I rolled over and saw my mom sitting up. I didn't even realize she'd unzipped the flap between our two tent sections to check on me. She was perfectly still, her back straight, staring toward the front of my tent. Her face looked pale in the moonlight. I whispered her name, but she didn't respond. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw it. A shape outside the mesh window. It looked like a person standing just beyond the thin nylon wall. The moon was bright enough to outline it clearly. The figure had long, tangled hair that hung down in wiry strands, and its head tilted slightly, like it was trying to see in. The face was hidden in shadow, but the posture was unmistakable. Someone or something was leaning close, peering into our tent. My chest tightened so fast it hurt. My first thought was that someone from another campsite had wandered too close. My second was that maybe it was one of those stories you hear about weird people camping out in the dunes. My mom didn't say anything. She just sat frozen, watching. The figure didn't move, not even when the wind picked up. I remember the faint smell of salt and wet grass drifting through the mesh, and my heart beat so loud I could barely hear the waves anymore. I wanted to ask her what it was, but before I could, I made a small sound, something between a gasp and a question, and that tiny noise must have startled it. The shape jerked suddenly, then there was a loud snort, deep and rough. The shadow shifted and I saw a glint of movement, a long neck, the twitch of an ear. It wasn't a person at all. It was one of the wild ponies, standing so close that its breath was fogging the outside of the tent. The hair I thought I saw was its mane, tangled and blowing in the breeze. Its head had been lowered, and it had leaned forward to sniff or investigate the tent. The realization hit both of us at the same time. My mom exhaled sharply and whispered that it was okay, that it was just a pony, though I could still hear the edge of fear in her voice. The animal backed up a few steps, sand crunching under its hooves, and then turned away. Through the window, I saw its dark shape moving across the moonlit sand, heading toward the dunes and the sound of the surf. We didn't know it then, but the tent had been set up right on one of their trails, a path the ponies used to move between the grassy marshes and the beach at night. They always took the same narrow routes, worn down by years of hoofprints. We must have blocked part of their way, and that one had probably been confused or curious, trying to figure out what was in its usual path. After it left, I lay awake for a long time. Every sound outside made me tense up again. The low thump of hooves, the faint snorting, the occasional distant call of another pony. I could picture them moving between the tents and picnic tables, their dark shapes slipping through the moonlight. My mom stayed sitting up for a while too, just listening. Eventually, she unzipped the flap completely and looked outside. I remember her flashlight beam sweeping across the sand, catching the glint of eyes in the distance, a small group of ponies grazing near the dunes. By morning, the whole thing felt unreal, like maybe we'd imagined it, but there were hoof prints everywhere, big, deep ones leading right past the tent, and a few so close to the fabric that they'd flattened the sand around the stakes. My dad laughed about it when we told him, saying that's what happens when you camp at Assateague. But my mom didn't find it funny. She moved the tent that afternoon a few yards farther inland, off the packed trail of sand. That night I heard the ponies again. Their hooves thudded softly against the ground as they made their way toward the beach. This time they didn't stop. They just passed by in silence, their shadows stretching across the sand, moving through the pale glow of the moon until they disappeared behind the dunes. It wasn't until years later, when I went back as an adult, that I realized how close we'd really been. The campsite still had faint tracks just like before. The ponies still followed the same narrow paths, unbothered by fences or tents or people. And when the wind shifted, carrying the ocean sound through the grass, I could almost picture that night again. The silhouette at the tent wall, the cold, quiet air, and the moment I learned that sometimes the things that scare you most in the dark aren't dangerous at all. They're just part of the place you happen to sleep. I live in a small rural town tucked between mountains and forests, the kind of place where you can walk out your back door and be standing in the woods within 5 minutes. Most people around here spend their weekends outside, especially in the summer. Camping is something we grew up doing so often it stopped feeling like an event and became more of a normal weekend routine. Even in winter, when the nights drop below freezing and the ground hardens, we'd still pack up and go. I'd always loved the quiet, The sound of the wind pushing through the trees, the smell of pine and smoke from the fire. It was something that made me feel calm. But there's one trip that stayed in my mind since I was 16. Something that even now makes my stomach tighten whenever I think about it. We were a group of maybe 7 or 8 kids, all between 16 and 19. We had set up camp near a river we liked to fish, surrounded by tall pines and steep ridges. It wasn't far from town, maybe a 15-minute drive, but it felt completely isolated. The main campsite was in a clearing with enough space for one big tent and a fire ring made of stacked rocks. We had brought one tent large enough to fit everyone, but when me and my friend realized the better fishing spot was about a mile downriver, we decided to split off for the night. We figured we'd have better luck catching something early in the morning if we camped closer to the water. It was a simple plan, and neither of us thought much of it. We packed only what we needed: some sleeping bags, a tarp, some rope, a hatchet, and a few cans of food. The sun was already dipping behind the mountains by the time we reached the spot, and the air had started to cool fast. The river was close enough that you could hear it moving steadily through the rocks. We found a large boulder in a clearing, and decided to build a lean-to against it, using some fallen branches and the tarp. It wasn't perfect, but it blocked the wind. We built a fire in front of it and sat for a while talking about random things, mostly fishing and school, until my friend decided to sleep. He curled up in his bag and was out in minutes. I sat near the fire for a while, staring at the flames and listening to the forest. Out there, the quiet has its own weight. You can hear every little thing: the crack of a stick, the shuffle of something small moving through leaves, the distant sound of the river. Usually that kind of silence is relaxing, but that night it wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. It wasn't anything I could prove, just that heavy, instinctive feeling that makes you look over your shoulder, even when nothing's there. I told myself it was probably a mountain lion. They were common around here, and I'd run into them before. As long as you don't act like prey, they leave you alone. That thought helped a little, but I still threw a few more logs on the fire just to make it brighter. The light flickered across the clearing, casting long shadows from the trees. I was sitting there staring into the fire when I looked up, and that's when I saw him. There was a man standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 80 yards away. The moon was full that night, bright enough to see without a flashlight, and the light hit him clearly. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing us. I couldn't see his face well, but I could tell he was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, wearing what looked like dark clothes or maybe a jacket. I froze completely. My first thought wasn't even fear, just confusion. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. Nobody else camps that far downriver, and it was already close to midnight. I don't know how long I sat there just staring. Felt like several minutes, though it might have been less. The fire crackled between us, and I remember hearing the faint sound of the river behind me, and the distant hiss of wind through the trees. But I couldn't look away from that figure. He didn't move closer, didn't wave, didn't say anything, just stood there. After a while, he slowly turned and walked off in the opposite direction, disappearing into the trees. That was it. No sound of footsteps on leaves, no flashlight, nothing. Just gone. I stayed there frozen for a long time, waiting for something else to happen. I didn't wake my friend at first because I didn't want to startle him. And honestly, I wasn't sure what I had even seen. Maybe it was some other camper. Maybe someone hiking back late, maybe even a hunter. That's what I kept telling myself. Still, I reached for my friend's .357 revolver that he kept beside his bag and held it the rest of the night. I didn't move from that spot. Every time the fire popped, my heart jumped. I kept staring into the tree line, half expecting to see that figure again. The hours crawled by. I remember glancing at my watch, 1:14, 2:37, 3:02. The night felt endless. At one point I thought I heard movement again from the woods, a faint rustling, but it stopped before I could even react. The fire eventually burned down to glowing embers, but I didn't add more wood. I didn't want to draw attention again if someone was out there watching. When the first light of dawn started to touch the tops of the trees, I finally felt some of the tension drain out of me. My friend woke up just before sunrise, groggy and confused about why I was still sitting up. I didn't tell him what I saw until later that day when we rejoined the others. I remember the look on his face when I told him. Not disbelief exactly, but quiet concern. We walked back to the clearing that afternoon just to check, but there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. The ground was hard and covered with pine needles, so it made sense. Still, the image of that man standing under the moonlight has never left my head. I can picture the exact outline, the way he stood perfectly still, like he was studying us. Maybe he was just passing through, maybe lost, maybe curious. I doubt he meant harm. But even now, whenever I go camping and sit by the fire alone, that night always creeps back into my thoughts. The silence doesn't feel the same anymore. It's not peaceful like it used to be. It feels like something could be standing just beyond the light, watching. I've learned a lot since then. How to handle encounters with wildlife. How to stay calm in the woods. How to use my instincts instead of panicking. If the same thing happened today, I'd probably call out, try to figure out who it was. But back then I was 16, inexperienced and terrified. That night changed how I see the woods. It reminded me that even when you think you know a place, there are still moments that can shake you to the core. The wilderness doesn't always feel wild because of the animals. Sometimes it's because you realize how alone you really are out there, and how easily someone could be watching without you ever knowing. It wasn't my story, but I've heard it enough times that I can almost picture it like I was there. My parents took a canoe trip years before I was born, somewhere deep in northern Saskatchewan. They were in their 20s then, just a couple of weeks off work chasing quiet and wilderness. It was one of those trips that takes planning. Maps spread across the table, gear packed into dry bags, the food divided into sealed containers. No cell service, no nearby towns, no easy way out if something went wrong. They had paddled for days through a maze of lakes and portages, following a line of black spruce and jagged rock that seemed to go on forever. By the time they set up camp that night, they were completely alone, just the sound of wind in the trees and water lapping against the rocks. The place they stopped was a small clearing near a narrow bay, surrounded by thick bush. The ground was soft with moss and pine needles, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke from their little campfire. They pitched the tent a few meters back from shore, just far enough that the sound of the lake faded into a background hush. The tent wasn't anything fancy, just a simple two-person dome, faded from years of use. They had a habit of organizing things neatly before sleeping. Paddles laid flat, food barrels sealed tight, canoe pulled up and flipped over. My dad always said there's a kind of peace that comes with that level of quiet. The world feels enormous and you feel small in a good way. That night they fell asleep to the sound of loons calling across the water and a faint breeze rustling through the trees. Sometime early in the morning, when the light outside was still gray and cold, my dad woke up to a strange sound. It was subtle at first, just a steady rustling in the bushes behind the tent. He thought it might be wind, or maybe a squirrel rummaging through leaves, the kind of background noise you usually ignore when camping. But after a few seconds, it grew louder. It was heavy, the kind of movement that sounded like something big, something with weight, was shuffling around just feet away. The rhythm of it didn't sound random either. It was slow, steady, and close. The kind of sound that sticks in your chest when you realize it isn't wind. Still half asleep, my dad tried to sit up, but before he could make sense of what was happening, the entire side of the tent buckled inward. There was a sudden, solid weight pressing down on him. It wasn't just the fabric collapsing. It felt like something enormous had leaned or fallen directly onto the tent. The whole side sagged against his shoulder and chest, and for a moment he couldn't move. My mom jolted awake beside him, startled by the impact and the sound of fabric straining. For a few long seconds, everything was muffled. The air inside the tent was cold, filled with the smell of wet nylon and dirt. My dad said he could feel the weight pressing down. Not crushing, but enough to pin him for an instant. And then, just as suddenly as it came, the pressure lifted. They both froze, completely still, listening. Outside, there was a sharp snort, a huffing sound that was unmistakably animal. The tent fabric rippled slightly as something moved away from it. My dad fumbled for the zipper, hands shaking now, and managed to open the flap just enough to see out. About 10 feet away, standing awkwardly in the open space near the bushes, was a black bear. It wasn't huge, maybe a young adult, but still easily a few hundred pounds. It looked confused, its head tilted slightly, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. Its fur was slick from dew, and its eyes caught the faint light in a way that made it look almost startled. It wasn't aggressive, it was just puzzled. For a few seconds it stood there breathing heavily, staring at the collapsed side of the tent as if trying to figure out what it had just done. Then it shifted its weight, sniffed the air, and took a hesitant step backward. My dad pushed himself out of the tent, heart pounding, trying to assess what had just happened. The ground behind the tent was torn up, pine needles scattered, branches bent, a clear sign of where the bear had come through. It must have been foraging in the low bushes for berries or grubs and lost its balance, stumbling right into the tent wall. The bear looked from my dad to the tent again, its posture unsure. It gave a low grunt, turned its head toward the tree line, and after a moment bounded off into the forest, the sound of its movement fading fast through the undergrowth. The clearing went silent again, the kind of silence that feels thick and unreal after something loud and sudden. My dad stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, the early morning air burning cold in his lungs. My mom crawled out of the tent behind him, her face pale but calm, looking at the mess of flattened fabric and trampled ground. The tent was lopsided now, one pole bent at an awkward angle where the bear had leaned or fallen on it. There were smears of dirt across the side, and a few long dark hairs caught in the fabric. They checked the rest of the camp. The food barrel was untouched, the canoe was fine, nothing else disturbed. Just that one strange accident. My dad always says that when he looked at those deep paw prints in the moss, it hit him how close it had been. A few more inches of weight, a shift in balance, and it could have been worse. After that, there was no point trying to go back to sleep. The air was crisp, and the sun was starting to burn through the mist that hung over the lake. They made coffee over the little stove and sat by the shore, watching the steam rise from their mugs, while the world around them slowly came alive. The only sound was the gentle slap of water against the rocks and the occasional cry of a loon echoing across the water. The tent still leaned crookedly behind them, a reminder of how quickly something peaceful can turn strange out there. Later that morning, as they packed up to move to another site, my dad took one last look at the spot. The flattened moss, the paw prints, the half-bent tent pole. It all looked so ordinary in daylight, but the memory of that heavy, sudden weight stayed sharp. He joked about it later, how not many people could say they'd literally been sat on by a bear. But there was always something in his voice when he said it, a mix of humor and quiet awe at how unpredictable the wilderness really is. They paddled away that morning under a pale blue sky, the water smooth and glassy around them. The forest looked calm again, endless and indifferent, as if nothing at all had happened. But my parents never forgot that night. Even years later, whenever they went camping, they always made sure to set the tent just a little farther from the tree line. Always kept one ear open for the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't fear exactly, just respect. A reminder that out there, you're never really alone, even when it feels like you are. It was mid-fall in Georgia, the kind of season where the days still felt warm enough to hike in a t-shirt, but the nights could get surprisingly cold. My friends and I had been doing these weekend hikes for years, 3 to 5 miles down some trailhead, set up camp where the trees thickened, and just enjoy the quiet. That weekend we drove out past Helen, parked near a narrow gravel road that wound deep into the Chattahoochee forest, and hiked until the sound of the road was completely gone. The air smelled like pine and old leaves, damp but clean, and the trail was covered in that mix of brown and gold that comes right before winter starts creeping in. we found a good spot just off the trail. A flat patch of ground with a half circle of trees that broke the wind. There was a small creek maybe 50 feet away, just enough to fill bottles and wash up. The sun had already started dipping when we got there, that soft orange light slipping between the trunks, so we got right to work. We cleared a ring for the fire, gathered deadwood, pitched 2 small tents. The temperature started to fall quick once the sun dropped. It was strange. Earlier that day it had been in the mid-60s, but by dusk you could already feel the bite of cold in the air. By the time we got the fire going, our breath was visible. One of my buddies pulled out a small thermometer he always carried and said it was already down in the 30s. That was rare for Georgia in mid-fall, especially that far south. The forest around us was absolutely still. No bugs, no wind. Just that low crackle of the fire and the occasional pop from the wood. We ate heavy. Some foil-wrapped potatoes, sausage, and beans cooked right over the flames. The kind of meal that makes you sleepy almost immediately after you finish it. The warmth from the fire mixed with the food, and before long, all of us had crawled into our sleeping bags. I remember how good it felt. Warm face, cold air, my body heavy and tired in the best way. At some point in the night, I must have drifted deep because when I woke up, I didn't know what time it was. The fire had burned down to mostly glowing coals. The air was so cold it felt like it had weight to it, like it pressed against your skin. I was tucked into my bag up to my chin when I felt something tapping at my foot. Not hard, just a few quick taps. I blinked and looked toward the sound. My buddy was sitting up bundled in his bag, holding a stick in one hand. He didn't say anything, he just nodded toward the fire. It took my eyes a few seconds to adjust. Then I saw them. 2 wild boars standing just a few feet from the fire pit, kicking at the dirt. They were big, dark shapes against the faint orange glow. The kind of size that makes your stomach drop when you realize how close they are. One of them had coarse, bristled fur that shimmered slightly in the firelight, and the other looked even thicker through the middle, like it could easily push a person over without trying. Their snouts were caked in dirt, and every now and then, one would grunt and push at the ground, rooting around like they were looking for scraps. My first instinct was to grab the hand axe we kept near the fire, but it was out of reach, lying on a log maybe 6 or 7 feet away. Too far to risk moving for it. I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my neck. The air was freezing, but sweat started forming along my hairline under the beanie I was wearing. Every small sound felt amplified. The crack of cooling embers, the slow shifting of my sleeping bag when I tried not to move. We just laid there, completely still, watching. The boars snorted and circled, their hooves crunching over the leaves. Every few seconds, one of them would glance toward us, nostrils flaring, and I'd hold my breath until it turned away. I'd seen videos and heard stories about them. People getting gored, tents ripped open, hikers chased down trails. In Georgia, they can get up to 150 pounds easy, and they're always mean. You don't even have to provoke them. Minutes stretched out. The fire died slower than I expected, the glow shrinking bit by bit until it was just dull embers. The darker it got, the closer they seemed to come. Their shapes were harder to see now, just black against black, but you could hear them breathing. Short, rough grunts followed by that low, scraping sound as they pawed at the ground. My legs were cramping from lying so still, and every time I swallowed, I was afraid the sound would carry. It must have been close to an hour, though it felt much longer. The cold was setting deep by then, to the point that the tip of my nose hurt. My buddy hadn't moved once. He was just watching with his eyes barely above his bag. I could tell he was thinking the same thing as me, that if we startled them, we were done for. Finally, after what felt like forever, one of the boars lifted its head and made this deep, hollow snort. Then it turned away from the fire pit and started trotting toward the trees. The second followed right behind, their shapes fading into the dark until all I could hear were the crunching leaves growing fainter and fainter. We didn't move for several minutes after they were gone. I just stared at the spot where they'd been, waiting to hear them come back. But the forest stayed quiet. When I finally sat up, the air burned in my throat from breathing too shallowly for so long. I could see my breath cloud out in front of me, thick and white. The fire was nothing but a few blackened coals. I reached over and grabbed the axe just to have it near. My friend exhaled this shaky breath, like he'd been holding it the entire time. We didn't speak. There wasn't anything to say, just this shared understanding that we'd gotten lucky. Really lucky. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the axe in my lap and sat facing the tree line, watching for any movement until the faintest gray light started to break through the woods. The cold never lifted, and by morning the thermometer read 21 degrees. Unreal for Georgia in October. We packed up quickly, faster than usual, neither of us saying much. On the hike back to the truck, we found their tracks cutting right across the trail where we'd come in. Fresh, heavy impressions in the damp dirt. Seeing them in daylight made my stomach twist. They'd been even bigger than they looked in the dark. That hike was supposed to be another quiet weekend away from noise and people, but after that night, the woods didn't feel the same. I still hike, but I don't sleep as easily out there anymore. That night taught me how close danger can get without making a sound, how fragile that thin layer of safety we think we have really is.